We all live in communities. Some big, some small. And whether we live in a bustling apartment building or a quiet cul-de-sac, we are all part of something bigger than ourselves, a web of neighbors, interactions, glances, greetings, and rhythms that define the place we call home. In many ways, being aware of our neighbors, paying attention to what's going on around us, is a good thing. It's how we stay safe, how we stay connected, how we offer help in times of need. But like many things in life, there is a line. And when that line is crossed, when awareness turns into intrusion, when watching becomes monitoring, we are no longer talking about community, we are talking about surveillance. The difference between observation and surveillance comes down to intention, frequency, and boundaries. Watching out for a neighbor's house while they're on vacation is an act of trust. Taking notice if someone seems unwell and checking in on them is rooted in empathy. But when someone begins watching your every move, noticing your comings and goings in detail, asking intrusive questions about your habits, guests, or routines, what's happening isn't rooted in concern, it's rooted in control. And it's important we call that out. Because when people monitor others under the guise of being good neighbors, they may be masking something deeper, a discomfort with uncertainty, a fear of the unfamiliar, or even an unconscious need to assert power in a world that often feels powerless. When we look at behavior through the lens of empathy, we must also look at context. Empathy is not about making excuses for inappropriate behavior, but it is about understanding where behavior might be coming from. The person who seems hyper-focused on what you're doing might not even recognize that what they're doing is unsettling. They may think they're being helpful, protective, or community-minded. Or maybe they're wrestling with anxiety that makes them seek control in their environment. This doesn't mean we let it go unaddressed. But when we approach these situations with curiosity rather than immediate judgment, we give ourselves the chance to respond instead of react. There's a quote I often come back to: clear is kind. Unclear is unkind. When we're uncomfortable with a neighbor's behavior, when we feel monitored, scrutinized, or even just watched a little too closely, it's tempting to avoid the situation altogether. We worry about being rude. We convince ourselves it's not a big deal. We make jokes about it to friends. But when we consistently feel uneasy, and especially when we begin changing our own behavior to avoid being watched, that's a sign our boundaries are being crossed. And when boundaries are crossed, clarity becomes not just a kindness, but a necessity. The heart of this is not about being suspicious or accusatory. It's about trusting ourselves. It's about recognizing the difference between feeling safe and feeling scrutinized. And it's about being able to name that difference out loud if necessary. If a neighbor repeatedly comments on when your lights go on and off, or makes notes about who visits your home, or seems to keep track of your schedule in ways that feel intrusive, it's okay to say, "I've noticed you bring up details about my daily routine that I haven't shared. I want to be respectful, but I also want privacy. Can we talk about that?" That kind of conversation takes courage. It also requires grace. But it can shift the dynamic from tension to understanding. What's important to remember is that setting a boundary is not an act of aggression. It's an act of self-respect. And you can set boundaries without burning bridges. In fact, many healthy communities are built on boundaries. They create the space for mutual respect, autonomy, and genuine care to grow. Without boundaries, what we call neighborliness can quickly become surveillance. And surveillance, even when wrapped in politeness or concern, erodes trust. Now let's talk about how this relates to shame and vulnerability. If you've ever felt like you were being watched too closely, you may also have felt ashamed of feeling bothered by it. You may have told yourself, "I'm overreacting," or "they're just being friendly." But vulnerability means telling the truth about our experiences. And if the truth is that someone's behavior makes you feel observed in a way that's uncomfortable, then that truth is valid. Shame keeps us silent. But when we speak up with empathy for ourselves and for others, we create the possibility of change. At its core, observation is about awareness. Surveillance is about control. And the shift from one to the other often begins with small moments, a lingering glance, a pattern of questions, a tone of voice. When we sense that shift, our job is not to assign blame, but to stay grounded in our values. If we value privacy, safety, and respect, then we have to live those values even when it's hard, even when it's awkward. That may mean initiating a difficult conversation, or setting firmer limits on what we are willing to discuss with neighbors. And it always means honoring our own inner sense of safety. Empathy in this context does not mean accepting behavior that crosses a line. It means holding space for both accountability and understanding. It means seeing the humanity in the person across the fence, even as we protect our own dignity. And it means choosing courage over comfort, because that's how real communities grow. Not by watching each other, but by seeing each other. Not by policing each other's lives, but by respecting them. If your neighbor's behavior leaves you feeling like you're being monitored, don't gaslight yourself. Trust your instincts. Then act with intention, not fear. Observation is rooted in care. Surveillance is rooted in fear. You deserve to live where the former is practiced, and where the latter is named, addressed, and transformed. We talk a lot about boundaries, what they are, why they matter, and how to set them, but rarely do we talk clearly about the ways they're crossed. Even more rarely do we name those boundary violations when they come from someone close by, like a neighbor. There's something about proximity, physical and emotional, that can make us doubt ourselves. We ask, am I being too sensitive, or they're just being neighborly, right? But when we ignore or rationalize the discomfort we feel, we're not protecting relationships, we're quietly betraying ourselves. And nothing erodes connection more quietly than the slow, steady draining of our sense of safety. Recognizing the signs of boundary violations requires us to first get honest about how we feel when they happen. Empathy begins with listening, not to others first, but to ourselves. If we walk outside and feel the need to look over our shoulder, if we pause before opening our blinds because we sense someone might be watching, or if we feel a sinking weight when someone always seems to be present, asking, commenting, or inserting themselves into our day, those aren't feelings we should ignore. Our bodies and minds are hardwired to detect when something doesn't feel right. That's not paranoia. That's wisdom. A neighbor who casually waves and says hello is participating in community. A neighbor who consistently comments on who's coming into your home, how long they stayed, or what time you left for work is no longer being casual. That's a pattern. And patterns matter. One comment might be random. Two could be coincidental. But when behavior repeats, when someone always seems to notice things about your routine, your visitors, or your habits, that's a signal. When questions begin to feel more like interrogations than conversations, your boundary is being tested, whether the person realizes it or not. It's important to remember that not all violations are loud or dramatic. Some are soft, subtle, and even polite. They come wrapped in smiles and concern. They sound like, "Oh, I noticed your car wasn't there last night. Everything okay?" Or, "That man who came by yesterday, haven't seen him before." They're comments disguised as care but laced with control. And when those comments become frequent, detailed, or intrusive, they move out of the realm of curiosity and into the space of monitoring. Empathy teaches us not to immediately label people as bad or malicious when they cross boundaries. Some people genuinely don't know they're doing it. Maybe they grew up in environments where privacy wasn't respected. Maybe they're struggling with loneliness or anxiety. Maybe watching others gives them a sense of purpose. These possibilities don't excuse the behavior, but they do offer us a way to respond with compassion. And compassion doesn't mean silence. Compassion means speaking clearly. It means saying, "I know you probably don't mean anything by it, but I value my privacy, and I'd like to keep some things personal." That kind of honesty isn't easy, but it's powerful. What makes boundary violations tricky is how they're often normalized. We hear things like, "That's just how she is," or "he's harmless," and we're conditioned to brush off behaviors that feel wrong. But when we constantly downplay how we feel, we disconnect from our own sense of reality. And over time, that kind of disconnection leads to resentment. It leads to hypervigilance. It leads to shame because we start believing we shouldn't feel how we feel. But your feelings are valid. Discomfort is data. And ignoring that data doesn't make it disappear, it just buries it deeper, where it festers. Another common sign of a boundary violation is the feeling of being emotionally cornered. Maybe a neighbor shows up at your door uninvited or stands at your fence, unwilling to end a conversation even when you give cues that you need space. Maybe they share inappropriate personal stories or try to elicit yours. This dynamic can feel confusing, especially if the person is friendly or well-liked in the community. But friendliness does not equal respect. And if someone consistently overrides your cues, your silence, your brief answers, your polite attempts to disengage, they are choosing their need for connection over your need for space. That's not empathy. That's entitlement. Boundary violations are also about access: emotional, physical, and energetic. If someone repeatedly tries to enter your personal space, pushes for details about your life, or expects you to be emotionally available when you're not, they are stepping beyond what you've consented to. And we don't need to wait for something dramatic to happen before we act. It's okay to respond to small, persistent behaviors. It's okay to protect your peace before it's completely disturbed. Empathy toward others cannot come at the cost of compassion toward ourselves. We can understand someone's loneliness without inviting them into every aspect of our life. We can see someone's need for connection without making ourselves their emotional caregiver. That's not cold. That's honest. And honesty, especially in the context of boundaries, is a form of love. Not everyone will understand your boundaries. Some may resist them. Some may question them. But your job is not to manage their response. Your job is to stay grounded in your values. And here's the truth about boundary work: it often gets harder before it gets easier. When you start asserting your needs clearly, people who benefited from your silence might feel threatened. That's not a sign you're doing it wrong. That's a sign you're doing it right. And while you can offer empathy to those who cross your boundaries, you don't have to shrink your needs to make them comfortable. At the end of the day, living with integrity means living aligned with what you know is right for you. If a neighbor's behavior consistently makes you feel observed, unsettled, or emotionally drained, that deserves your attention. You don't need permission to feel what you feel. And you don't owe constant access to your time, your energy, or your life. Your boundaries are the architecture of your peace. And when someone begins to chip away at them, no matter how subtle or unintentional, it's not just okay to reinforce them. It's necessary. With empathy, yes. But also with clarity, courage, and self-respect. When we talk about the experience of feeling watched or monitored by someone, especially a neighbor, it's easy to jump straight into discomfort, frustration, or even fear. And those feelings are valid. But if we want to build real understanding and stay grounded in both empathy and truth, we have to ask a deeper question: why do people monitor others in the first place? What is the psychology behind this behavior that can feel so invasive, even when it's done under a veil of politeness or concern? The first thing we need to acknowledge is that monitoring, especially in a community or neighborhood context, is often rooted in the need for control. And the need for control almost always traces back to fear. People who watch others closely are often trying to make sense of a world that feels uncertain, unstable, or unpredictable. Their attention on others becomes a coping mechanism. It gives them a sense of order, a sense of control over their environment, especially when they feel like their internal world is spinning. By focusing on what other people are doing, they create the illusion of stability, even if it comes at the cost of someone else's privacy or peace. That doesn't make the behavior okay. It just makes it understandable. And when we understand something, we can name it clearly. We can respond from a place of grounded empathy instead of reactionary emotion. People who engage in this kind of hypervigilant observing may not even be fully aware of what they're doing. They're not always setting out to make others uncomfortable. But the intention doesn't erase the impact. And it's important to hold both truths at once. Sometimes, monitoring behavior comes from past experiences of trauma or betrayal. A person who has lived through chaos, whether in childhood or adulthood, may have learned to keep themselves safe by knowing everything that's going on around them. They don't trust easily. They've developed a belief, whether consciously or not, that being aware of other people's actions is the best way to prevent harm. In their world, monitoring isn't about intrusion, it's about survival. But when that learned behavior starts to extend beyond their own front door, when it bleeds into watching someone else's home, routine, or personal life, it becomes a boundary issue. There's also a social dimension to monitoring. In some communities, people are raised with the idea that keeping tabs is part of being a good neighbor. They've learned that asking questions, offering unsolicited opinions, or observing people's habits is just part of being involved. Again, there may be no malice in this, but it doesn't make the behavior healthy. Surveillance masquerading as concern is still surveillance. And when you consistently monitor someone else, you're not building community, you're performing control. Another layer to this is the role of loneliness. Loneliness has become a silent epidemic. Many people feel disconnected, isolated, or invisible. Watching others, especially those with lives that appear full or social, can become a way of feeling connected, even if from a distance. When someone focuses on your life, what you do, who you see, how you live, it may be because their own life feels painfully quiet. You become a kind of projection screen for their unspoken needs. And while it's heartbreaking to think that someone's unhealthy behavior stems from such deep emotional hunger, it's also not your responsibility to be their emotional placeholder. Then there are those who monitor others because they believe they are entitled to know. This often shows up as entitlement disguised as moral superiority. These are the people who believe they have a right to comment on your decisions because they've convinced themselves they would have made a better one. They're not just watching, they're judging. They see your choices, your visitors, your schedule as something to critique, and they mask it as community standards or moral concern. But at its core, this behavior is about power. It's about positioning themselves as an authority not out of love, but out of ego. In some cases, people who monitor others struggle with boundaries themselves. They don't know where they end and someone else begins. They see other people's lives as open invitations, not because they're cruel or nosy, but because no one ever taught them about emotional separation. They never learned that curiosity doesn't always need to be acted upon, and that just because you notice something doesn't mean you need to comment on it. Their lack of boundaries is not your burden, but it is something to be aware of when deciding how to engage. What makes all of this so complicated is that these behaviors don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by culture, personal history, and community dynamics. In some cultures, collective living and interdependence are the norm, and privacy looks very different than it does in more individualistic societies. But even within those contexts, there's a difference between connection and control. True community doesn't require you to sacrifice your sense of self. It asks for mutual respect, not constant oversight. So what do we do with all of this? We start by telling the truth. We name what we see. We don't sugarcoat behavior that feels violating. At the same time, we choose to believe that most people aren't trying to be harmful, they're trying to manage something inside themselves. When we approach these situations with curiosity rather than defensiveness, we give ourselves the emotional space to respond instead of react. Sometimes that means having an honest conversation with a neighbor, gently letting them know that their comments or questions feel intrusive. Sometimes it means creating more distance, physically or emotionally, from someone whose monitoring feels excessive. And sometimes it means simply trusting ourselves more, believing that if something feels off, we don't need to justify or explain it away. Empathy doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior. It means recognizing the humanity in others while fiercely protecting our own. It means asking not just why someone behaves the way they do, but also what we need in order to feel safe and respected. Understanding the psychology behind monitoring doesn't mean we tolerate it, it means we face it with clarity, compassion, and boundaries. Because we all deserve to live in spaces where we are seen, not watched. Where we are respected, not observed like characters in someone else's private story. And when we remember that, we make space not only for our own peace but for healthier, more authentic communities too. There's something deeply human about wanting to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Most of us weren't raised in environments that modeled what healthy boundaries looked like, let alone how to talk about them with grace. And yet, if there's one truth I've learned from the work I do, it's that boundaries are not barriers, they're the foundation of compassion, connection, and emotional clarity. Without boundaries, even our closest relationships can become lopsided. With boundaries, we don't just protect ourselves, we show others what's okay and what's not okay. We create space for trust to grow. When we're dealing with someone who feels like they're monitoring us, especially a neighbor, it can feel particularly tricky. There's physical proximity, there's social pressure, and there's the fear of rocking the boat. We tell ourselves, I don't want to make it awkward, or it's not worth starting something over. But here's what we forget, avoiding a hard conversation doesn't make the discomfort go away. It just buries it. And buried discomfort eventually grows into resentment, anxiety, and disconnection. Healthy boundaries are not about controlling other people. They're about being clear about what we need to feel safe and respected. They're about saying, this is where I end, and you begin. When we don't articulate our limits, we silently invite others to cross them. That's not their fault, it's a signal for us to get more honest with ourselves and with them. The hard part is that many of us wait until we're already upset to set a boundary. We let things slide. We laugh off the first few intrusions. We over-explain, hoping the other person will pick up the hints. But boundaries whispered in frustration rarely land well. That's why the real work happens in the moments when we're calm. It happens when we can speak from clarity, not anger. Let's say a neighbor repeatedly comments on your schedule, your guests, or what they happen to notice about your home. It starts small. A casual remark. A friendly question. And slowly, you begin to feel a shift. You start closing your blinds more. You time your walks to avoid running into them. You feel tension instead of ease. That's your cue. Not to blow up or shut down, but to get curious about what you're feeling and what you need. Do you need more privacy? Do you need them to stop asking certain questions? Do you need to feel like your home is a space you can move through without being observed? Once you've named what you need, the next step is finding the courage to speak it out loud. And this is where so many of us get stuck. Because courageous conversations are vulnerable. They ask us to be both honest and kind. They ask us to risk discomfort for the sake of clarity. But there is nothing more kind than being clear. When you tell someone what you need, you give them the dignity of truth. You stop dancing around discomfort, and you step into integrity. A conversation with a neighbor might sound like, I've noticed that you often mention details about my schedule or visitors, and while I know you probably mean well, I really value my privacy. I'd appreciate it if we could keep things a bit more general. That's not rude. That's respectful. It acknowledges their intent while making your boundary unmistakably clear. It gives them the opportunity to adjust, and it gives you the space to breathe. It's also important to manage expectations. Not everyone will respond positively to your boundaries. Some may get defensive. Some may act confused. Some may minimize your concerns. But your boundary doesn't require their understanding to be valid. Your peace isn't up for negotiation. And the beauty of living in alignment with your values is that you stop needing everyone to agree with you, you just need to stay honest with yourself. What helps in these moments is grounding yourself in your why. Why are you setting this boundary? Is it to feel safe? To reduce anxiety? To maintain dignity in your home? Hold on to that why. Write it down if you need to. Because boundaries rooted in purpose are easier to stand by when things get hard. They become less about what the other person is doing, and more about what you're choosing to no longer tolerate in order to protect your well-being. One thing we often forget is that boundaries can be kind and firm. You don't have to yell to be taken seriously. You don't have to explain every detail of your life to justify your limits. You can simply say, that's not something I'm comfortable talking about, or I'd prefer not to share that. And you can say it with softness and strength. Sometimes, courageous conversations don't even need to happen face to face. A note. A message. A boundary set through changed behavior. These are all valid forms of communication, especially if you're dealing with someone who tends to deflect or escalate. What matters most is that you choose to act from self-trust rather than fear. What matters is that you stop waiting for someone to cross the line one more time before you finally speak up. Boundaries are an act of love. Not just for others, but for yourself. They say, I care about this relationship enough to be honest. They say, I believe in my right to peace. And they invite others to show up with the same level of respect. Not everyone will. And that's okay. The people who can't handle your boundaries are the ones who benefited most from you not having any. That's a hard truth but a freeing one. Ultimately, courageous conversations are not about conflict. They're about clarity. And clarity is a form of compassion. When we step into those moments with intention, with self-awareness, and with empathy, we don't just protect ourselves, we model what healthy connection looks like. We show our neighbors, our communities, and ourselves that respect and honesty are not mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand. You deserve to live in a space where you are not just seen, but respected. Where conversations are real, and boundaries are honored. And when you choose to speak your truth with courage and grace, you open the door for something powerful, not just peace, but dignity. If you found value in this message, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. I truly appreciate each one of you for being here. Thank you for watching, and remember, awareness, empathy, and boundaries are not just tools for protection, they're the foundation of healthy, empowered living. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.